So now we're ready to have a look at the different options when it comes to cutting data, whether source data comes along with the cutter, and what we can do in the event that source cutting data is missing. Because what we want to do is we want to limit the amount of your manual intervention, and make sure every time you have yourself a tool library, it becomes immediately useful. Right? So what kind of tools do we have available? I'm going to back up and I'm going to look at our live session of PowerMill. On our live session of PowerMill, I only have two tools right now. As you can see from this list, one of them has source cutting data, the other one does not. Okay? If I add this to our Fusion library exactly as is, let's have a peek at what's going on. Let's start with the button cutter right over here. This button cutter has two cutting data profiles, one roughing, one finishing, or perhaps the user, wanted different cutting rates between, the two operations, right? And naturally, if we have a look at any one of these cutting data profiles, you'll see they have been associated. Right over here up at the top, you've got the optional opportunity to associate your cutting data if it's indeed obvious. So naturally, I took the finishing cutting data profile and associated it with finishing operations. Same idea for roughing. Okay? Again, that's optional, right? But what happens in the event of a cutter without source cutting data? Okay, I'm going to give you a quick preview at where we sorted this out. Okay? Inside of PowerMill, the button cutter that had the source cutting data, it was created as roughing general and finishing general. And if you wanted to see specifically what those cutting data values were, for those familiar with PowerMill, you just had to click on your cutting data sets. But this end mill cutter right over here, it was absolutely missing source cutting data. And as we said, we wanted to make this library immediately valuable to users. Okay, so we've pre-populated it with 4 different materials and 4 different cutting data sets, right? And each of these cutting data sets, had cutting data, but along with modifiers like lead-in modifiers, lead-out, ramp angle, everything one would expect to sort of see, right? Now, this doesn't mean that you absolutely have to accept these default values. As a matter of fact, you've got every tool at the fingertips for adjusting how these cutting data sets come in. And that would be available in the import settings, shop standards, cutting data. Okay? You first decide, well, do we want to even bring in generic cutting data, right? You certainly have the option for never if you prefer. Okay? And of course, you got the option to keep or ignore source cutting data. But chances are users will always want to preserve that source cutting data. But getting back to the generic populated cutting data whenever absent, those options are configurable to you where you've got 4 common materials. You're just going to decide what's going to be the surface speed that I want to apply to these cutters, what's going to be the default coolant settings for the various materials, right? And of course the various cutting materials as well, right? Tool materials. Does your tool or machine have a maximum feed rate? So you never want to go above your maximum feed rate, or RPM, that is. And of course, the indexable, solid, and hole making categories allow you to decide what do you want your default feed per tooth to be, or step down, or step over, or ramp angle. Each one of these is configurable, and we've separated indexables from solids from hole making, because chances are the user is going to want to set their own defaults. So any one of these fields right over here is updatable. Please do so as you see fit, and be mindful of feed scaling as well. So feed scaling is where you've got the opportunity back in Fusion. Do you want to adjust your lead in percentage feed rate, or lead out, or transitional, right, or ramp or plunge feed rates? Okay, and then you certainly have a preview here of what we call feed per tooth scaling. So feed per tooth scaling, 7th thou feet per tooth for a 1-inch cutter, but naturally as you use a smaller cutter, you might want to adjust your percentage of that 7th thou feet per tooth So you'll see it can drop down all the way to 7/10 if you wish. Right. So lots of opportunities for you in this shop standards. Choose to use them, yes or no, and how do they get applied? You've just seen it right now. The tool that had no cutting data was automatically associated with 4 different cutting sets. You just have a peek at it and adjust these things as you see fit. I hope you find that useful.